welcome. Thank you so much. Sorry about the late start. We had a technical delay with our prior one, so everything got pushed back a little bit. Peggy Chang from the CRC. I'm very happy to be facilitating this panel with Devin and Takeru. They've thought a lot about the relationship, the commonalities of their two projects. They both did honors theses, right? Correct? Takeru is most likely going to be graduating with honors in international relations. And Devin, your thesis is in Africana Studies and Portuguese and Brazilian?
Only Africana.
Okay, although you're a double concentrator. Wanted to note that we're doing a fun little thing. If you have a paper copy or if you already have this on your mobile device, we're doing something called the Synergy Award. So the Synergy Award is going to go to the group presentation that is greater than the sum of its parts. So if you think that these two are deserving of the Synergy Award, please text the word mirror to the phone number that you see here. It's Google phone number 678-SYNTAI5. So definitely wanted to note that. This is one of 14 panel or group presentations. We're having a poster session. There are almost 70 seniors participating in the conference, and thank you so much for coming. Without further ado.
Cool. So I guess we can just do introductions. My name is Takeru. As Peggy said, I'm a senior concentrating in international relations, and I will be presenting about humanitarian responses today.
And just for the purposes of the filming, make sure you're talking into the mic.
Okay.
Okay? Great.
It feels more official this way too. Cool.
And as all of you know, I'm Devin, and I'm going to be talking about Brazilian music videos.
Cool. So as we were saying, each person in this room should have 3 post-it notes of different colors. We're going to do a brief activity now called the mirror activity. And it's really cool. So what we're going to do is ask all of you to write things that you think of when we say Brazil, Haiti, and Japan. Anything's fine. Stereotypes of the countries and their people, prominent national issues, facts, narratives, all that kind of good stuff. And honestly, if nothing really comes up to your mind when you hear these 3 countries, then you can just leave it blank. Should we ascribe colors to the countries too?
Don't worry about it.
Well, let's say Brazil is green, Japan is orange, and Haiti is blue. And once you are all done with writing, whatever it is that comes to your mind pops up to you, you can go up to the mirror and stick it right underneath the window pane that has what's written about it.
Yeah, so just as an example, when I think of Japan, first things that pop into my mind are kimonos, technology, and anime, probably. So whatever you think of is great.
I think when I think of Brazil, I think of the World Cup, sambas, women dancing, that kind of stuff. So we're going to take around 3 minutes. And then again, if you are finished, go up to where Peggy is and put the post-it note underneath the area. Japan is orange. Is it not? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and while you're up there, whoa, that's loud. If you want to take a look at other people's stuff and just see what everyone's saying, that would be great.
Smartphone cameras are a wonderful thing. Just love
All right, so we don't want to just put these things on a mirror and leave them there. We're definitely going to talk about them. Before we start a conversation, I just want to say, we're going to be talking about personal identity, which is a very personal thing. And, we don't want to make anyone feel guilty or stupid or anything like that. We really want everyone to just express themselves. And part of what we're talking about here is how thought and knowledge is formed. And so we want to hear what you think so that we can examine that.
So we have two questions today that pertains to this activity. The first one being, was it easier to write about certain countries than others? What aspects of these countries were more salient to you? In what situations and from what sources have you learned about these countries? Who taught you them? So we were going to break up into smaller groups, but since we already are a smaller group, I guess it's just cool to sort of, talk about things. I guess we're all friends. Specifically Devon's friends. So.
Yeah, so if you feel like, so if you guys have some ideas for this, or if you want to turn to the person next to you really quick and just talk about it so that we can get our brain juices rolling, that works too. You want to do that? Just turn to the person next to you and have a little discussion, and then we'll bring it up before the rest of the group.
I think that it's fiction, but it's like I do have some of them, but I have
so I found it easier to think about Japan. But where the other two, I have a very abstract concept of. That is what you were like, oh yeah, Asia. That's very cool.
And I was like, and I was just feel like, what would America so?
Yeah, I know because like I so like awkward, a lot of people awkward like that.
Yeah.
Also,
It makes me think
no, I didn't write down. But that's
All right. So it seems like there's a lot of discussion. Let's get some thoughts. Are there anything interesting or insightful that was said in your little small groups?
Or just something that you want to share? Anything?
I found it easier to write about Japan and Brazil than it was to write about Haiti. And I think that seemed to be because I feel like aspects of Japanese and Brazilian culture are like more present in the culture that I'm exposed to in the US than Asian culture. So I thought that was interesting and I wondered what that connects to.
I also found myself trying to say really positive things about these countries, mainly because I'm from Brazil and it seems to be that the top 10 things people say about Brazil, at least 6 of them are pretty negative. And they tend to be the same top 10 things. So it's also trying to think either in positive terms or to get out of what, like a first reaction, what those countries would mean to me, or I would think of like knee-jerk reaction.
I experienced just in talking about this, like kind of like a cultural awkwardness, particularly surrounding Haiti. That we were really well in America say at a party that went to Haiti, and I'd be like, "What's up? Like, how you doing? Everything's good."
Yeah, I also felt like so when for the question was easier to write about certain countries than others, I would say yes, and I felt like for me when I was thinking of these countries, I very much thought of these countries being condensed into certain images that was then mediated by the media and distributed everywhere. So I thought of Japan, I thought about sushi, and I thought about cute girls, I thought about Kitty, and I these are the things I thought about. And these were like the most iconic images that kept being fed to me through a certain medium. And so when I came to Brazil and Haiti, for example, it was also like certain music articles and stuff.
Yes.
I think we found this in our group, and I personally found that exactly what Sharina was saying, that I sort of had to rely on what the media told me about Brazil and Haiti, or Japan I've been to, so I kind of could bypass some of the media because I've been there, so I could draw more on my own personal experiences. And some of the other people in my group have taken specific classes on some of these countries, so they have a much broader area of knowledge they could draw on instead of Hello Kitty and sushi.
Yeah, so does anyone else want to talk about sort of their sources for the knowledge that they do have or do not have? That would be great. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm thinking about like the concept of like the society of the spectacle, which is to say that we are consuming images of these different places, and like what we consume is basically us saying we want to go to sleep and not think about it. And like the most simple, the easiest way to simplify like our consumption of these obviously very complex places, and just to have that kind of out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting how the sources are completely different for each country for me. So like pretty much my only information about Haiti comes from like news articles surrounding the earthquake and also talking about like history, but still all surrounding this like news event or this like huge event that happened in Haiti. And whereas like I think most of my information about Brazil comes from like music videos and like media and Devin, but it comes from more like Brazilian artists who are in the U.S. or things like that, and then from Japan it's a lot more like I've read like technology articles about Japan, or like it's been animes on TV, or I've read like Japanese food. So I think that the sources are all very different about how it's organized.
All right, well, I feel like that was a great opening. You guys are just on top of things. No surprises. And so, yeah, do you want to take it
Yeah,
away?
so I'm also sure that when you all looked up and saw what other people were writing, there were a lot of things that you already knew and already thought. People have said that they've got it from media, they've got it from classes that they've taken, and the people that they've known. But there are also things that we haven't really considered ourselves.
So this mirror, we want you to think about it as a mass media on a smaller scale. So maybe just media. But anyway, so when you look up there and you see things that confirm your previous ideas, you're having those conceptions reinforced. And then when you look at things that you haven't thought of before, you're having new ideas constructed in your mind as well. And these are the twin concepts that we're going to be emphasizing in this talk.
Yeah, so when Deb and I were talking, we were just saying how the media is, the mirror itself is a visual metaphor. At least the ways in which we approach both of our topics, in the sense that it not only is the creator of content, where we all sort of wrote things and created these things down, but also when you saw it and went up there, they were actively constructing them as well.
Now, clearly this is not quite the same as mass media because it was produced by you guys, and mass media is produced by companies, by producers. It's a professional thing. But because they're trying to appeal to such a broad audience, they are going to try to reflect the culture of that audience. And at the same time, the whole idea of communication is constructing new thoughts and getting people to access different sets of information.
So our project takes this understanding of the media and we specifically apply it to the context of race and national identity.
We both found that these ideas, race and national identity, were being sort of traditional ideas were being reinforced in the mass media because, as someone already said, they're simple and easy to understand, and so they are a great way of communicating with a broad audience that doesn't have necessarily much more than this in common. But the other problem is that they're perpetuating these stereotypes that can be oppressive or just create issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And whereas I think Devin's project focuses more at the personal and interpersonal level, we also see how these representations of nations and races in themselves can have real-world outcomes in terms of policy implications, diplomatic relations, legislation. So, whether they be monolithic or diverse portrayals, we heard that, we couldn't really conjure anything up for Haiti, whereas for Japan there were multiple diverse sources. Media representations in themselves have implications on all these things, and therefore it's essentially it's extremely important to sort of analyze them in a critical manner.
And I think for both of us, it was because of this vast influence that we see coming from the mass media that we decided to do critical analyses of media for our projects.
Mm-hmm. And also, just to be clear, when we say mass media, we're talking about the means of communication that has a large, wide scope in terms of reaching a huge amount of audience through means of technology. So we want to keep these ideas in mind. The mirror metaphor is going to be there throughout our presentation. So first up, Devin's going to be talking about her research, the representation of Brazilian women, and then I'll be talking about portrayals of Haiti and Japan and the aftermaths of their disasters. Afterwards, we will, in the final section, just have a brief conversation about our topics and then open up the floor to more general discussion. So, take some notes, keep some ideas in mind. All right.
All right, so my project was looking at images of Afro-Brazilian women in Brazilian music videos. And I just want to start you guys off with a little context. I think that the video I'm about to show you is pretty representative of the type of content that I was dealing with. It's quite different from American pop, so I wanted you guys to get a sense of it. Oh, good. Great. I'm sorry, could we have speakers attached to this?
It's someone played audio, and the last one was quite loud. So
Okay,
I don't
well,
know if it's
maybe-
just-
I can hear it.
Can you guys all hear it?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Oh, shh.
Maybe hold the mic up to it.
That's a good idea.
No, stop that. wanted you guys to see the kind of things that is on the top 40 list, which is what I looked at. So I analyzed 112 videos that were in the Brazilian Billboard magazine's top 40 airplay list between March and December of 2013. And of these, about 18% had one or more black women in them. So it wasn't that Afro-Brazilian women were not at all present in these videos, but they were confined to very specific roles, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on here. There was one black woman, you can see her there, Jesuton, who was in the top 40. She was the only principal artist. But she is actually British, and she was singing covering an American song. And so her situation is quite different, and certainly her foreign identity changes the power dynamics that are at play around her success. I found 3 basic video types, and I would say that maybe 1 or 2 videos didn't fit into these. So there's pretty consistent narratives being told in these videos. The first is the party video at the top there, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just showing people drinking, dancing, flirting, attempting sexual interactions. The next is the performance video, which takes the form of either a live concert or a stylized performance. And the third is the love story, which is also a pretty classic trope. And you'll see that I've circled here so you can, the images I'm sure are a little blurry, but these are the women that I have identified as Afro-Brazilian, and which has its own complications. We'll go into that in a minute. But the roles you see them in here are pretty much where they were, or exclusively really where they were across the board in these videos. They're in the background. They are backup singers. Pretty frequently, actually, these women are backup singers, but they don't make it to the front of the stage for whatever reason. And they are dancers in the party videos, partygoers, objects of sexual desire. And as far as the love story videos go, there really are not black women represented as the objects of romantic desire. And I think this is the most significant moment, because there are white women represented as objects of sexual desire, but you don't find black women in the role of the lover. So going back to the video we started with, which is actually called Agua na Boca, it means mouth watering. And so I want to talk a little bit about Brazilian race relations and conception of race, because it is quite different from US conceptions. Brazilians think of race as more fluid. It's more of a spectrum than a binary. So there's black and white at the extremes, but then there are many different identifications in between that. And the interesting thing about the Agua na Boca video is that all of these colors are represented in the women who are being portrayed, who are dancing, who are being objectified. So again, it's not that these roles are exclusive to black women, but it's the exclusion from other roles that we'll see as important. So this goes back a long time, and here's where we get into the reflection of Brazilian culture in these videos. Brazil became a republic in 1889, and it had freed its slaves, the last country to abolish slavery, in 1888. And as a result, it was forming this republican identity, this government based on representation, and it had a huge population of black citizens that needed to be incorporated into this national identity. And beyond that, there was a significant amount of intermixing between, mostly through the rape of black women by white men. And so as Brazil was forming a national identity around these republican ideals, they came up with this idea of Mother Africa and Father Europe, in a way, that they did identify with African heritage as a nation. But this identity was based in the idea that the reason there was so much intermixing was because black women were so sexy and so, excitable that Portuguese men just couldn't resist them. And so you have this national identity being formed on the basis of hypersexualization of Afro-Brazilian women. So you can see already how these videos in 2013 are reflecting these really racist ideals that are forming Brazilian identity in the early 20th century. So the other thing is, although there is this spectrum, one thing I want to talk about in terms of the women in this video is that 4 of the 5 of these women would be identifiable as morena, which is, except probably for the one in the bottom left there on the pink background, they could be a part of this single identity, single word anyway for identity, which means brunette or dark complexioned. And I wanted to show you the images to give you a sense of how broad that identity is. And it comes also out of this formation of Brazilian national identity. And it's a later concept than the ones I was just talking about. But in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you get this theorization of Brazil as all one race, as all moreno, all this single brown abstract sense of race that's very different from what was operating before. And so racial identity is extremely closely linked to national identity and the formation of a national history and story around what Brazil is. And so when I talk about Afro-Brazilian women and images portrayed of them, it's not a trivial topic at all. It's related to something fundamental in Brazilian identity. So some of these dynamics are played out really beautifully in this next video that I want to show you. This is Show das Poderosas by Anitta, and that means Show of the Powerful Women. Oh, it's doing it again. Sorry. So if we switch over to an image, because I want you to be able to look at it instead of just watching, you'll see that basically, again, we have all of these women pretty much hypersexualized, objects of sexual attraction. But the main difference that I noticed in this video is that Anitta, the main singer, has straightened hair, and she's the only one with straight hair. And in Brazilian conceptions of race identity, hair is really important. There are ideas of good hair and bad hair, and straight or wavy hair is the good hair, the beautiful hair. And so, but I want to show you, so this is Anitta. These are both of the same woman. And clearly, before her fame, Anitta had fairly curly hair and brown skin. And so the whitening that she's enacted or has been enacted upon her, it's impossible, I have no idea who's responsible, is really what sets her apart from her dancers. And it's what puts her at the top of the stage. Her success is contingent on her embodiment of this European ideal of beauty. And that connects also to the exclusion of black women from the romantic tale, because beauty is connected to romantic desire. And so black women can be objectified, can have their bodies valued, but they are not considered beautiful, they are not connected with that kind of desire. And so you have clearly, and then with that being connected to this national story, you have here in these images the reflection of Brazilian ideas. And then this video has 170 million views. And so if these videos consistently are showing these patterns of representation and sending them out to huge populations, you have this reinforcement and also reconstruction of the same ideas. But I don't want to end on that note. I really believe in the action part of this conference, and I think that these images, we are the ones consuming it, as you mentioned before. And so we have control over what makes money, what gets disseminated over social media. And it's really important for us to seek out those alternative narratives and not just critique the narratives that are there, but present other options. Because until people have other choices, they won't be able to make a choice. And so I just want to end with one more video. This is by Luciana Oliveira. And just to show you that these narratives are out there, these artists are out there, and they're just not being greeted with success or the level of success to make it into the top 40. So without further ado, this is Femenina, which means, it's actually in 2 words, which means have faith, girl. And that did not work again. That's it.
Before we go to Takeru, are there a couple of questions for Devin before we transition?
What
Yes.
was the 2 or 3 of these that didn't fit into the other part of your performance? So let's start.
Okay, so one of them was a video about a schoolroom where you had a bunch of women dressed in tiny schoolgirl outfits and 2 men singing about how you should only flirt and kiss and not marry a woman. So that's one example. It was not a party, but it didn't really differ much in its message about women. So that was one example.
This is probably a waste of time. The girl, the white girl in the video in the box, that color, like the background, you said it was pink. It looked totally purple to me.
I don't know, maybe the color's distorted.
That's it.
More questions? Yeah.
Of the 3 groups, what percentage roughly was the romantic story of the whole?
I did not do that analysis. It was something that the trend appeared to me as I was going through it, but I hadn't written down exactly which videos were which. So I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you.
Could you talk a little bit more about the complications of defining Afro-Brazilian women? Because, I remember years ago my mother sitting in my living room here in Providence, and my mother is Brazilian, and we're watching some show and Vanessa Williams is singing. And when they cut off to commercial, the announcer says something like, here's the first Black American woman to, what was it, Miss USA or something like that? Miss America. And my mother turns to me and said, who's Black? So from her perspective, Vanessa Williams wasn't Black. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was an extremely difficult problem that I don't have the answer to. I don't think anyone does. There is no escaping the fact that I am a white North American looking at these videos and bringing my own ideas to them. What I try to do is, having spent 4 years studying Brazilian race relations, I guess I ended up somewhere in between what the Black movement would argue and what I think my Brazilian friends and Brazilian theorists often argue. So somewhere between that extreme of Blackness on that spectrum. And the Black movement in Brazil has often said that more Brazilians need to claim their African heritage because that will give power to the movement. And so I tried to consider, basically one of my major arguments in the overall paper was talking about aesthetic discrimination. And so all of this happens on a daily basis in terms of individuals when, they're casting a movie or a film, or video is really the word I was going for there. They're looking at women and they're saying, that's beautiful, that's not beautiful, that's we want in our video, that we don't. And so in terms of that, I was trying to consider, like, if a caster were looking at these women, would they consider them to be this sort of othered identity, or would they consider them to be the norm? And so that was the best attempt I could make at it. And honestly, hair was a huge factor in my decision, because the way I've heard hair talked about in terms of Brazil, and this is also based in some of the theory that I read, that is one of the defining factors, not just for others identifying women, but women identifying with a particular race, that a lot of women who are trying to own the negra identity are, part of it has to do with accepting their natural hair texture. And so I did my best to follow those very subjective guidelines.
So we're going to actually do more questions afterwards. We're going to move to Takeru. There'll definitely be time for more individual questions and questions for the two of us up here. So thanks.
Thanks for your questions as well.
So before I begin, a bit of a caveat. Media is not technically the central argument or angle of my thesis. And also, the way that I formatted my presentation today is kind of based on the IR discipline. So there's a bit of a different focus, and the style itself might seem a bit regimented and jarring. So please excuse that. But yes, my topic is about humanitarian responses to natural disasters, and I point to the notion of victimhood, or how we think and talk about victims as portrayed through the media as affecting humanitarian response. So a bit of a backstory. When I was a freshman at Brown, the earthquake and tsunami happened in Japan. And I was actively involved in a lot of the campus efforts to raise money. And despite the vast amount of media attention and coverage given to Japan, a lot of things I kept hearing were things like, whether people should donate. Did Japan really need the help? Or what kind of help or what kind of response was really justified? And it really got me to start thinking, how are these decisions to respond to a disaster informed? I think natural disasters in themselves are extremely important things that we need to be looking into. Due to climate change and environmental degradation, natural disasters are projected to rise throughout the next couple of years. Foreign disasters are increasingly global in dimension. They have widespread economic impacts. They mobilize a huge international humanitarian effort. They also touch on issues of immigration, migration, energy, and whatnot. And also human lives are inherently at stake. Especially in developing society, a lot of these societies that are rapidly urbanizing and don't necessarily have the adequate infrastructures and resources necessary to offset a lot of the outcomes of the disasters. So those are the reasons why it's important to really, why there is an obligation, at least for me, to kind of try to understand what influences and affects response. And that's essentially what my thesis is about. So that being said, let's just jump right into the research question. What explains humanitarian responses to natural disasters? And then a corollary to that is, why do certain disasters get heightened attention while others are forgotten? According to the United Nations, there are over 18 million people around the world currently who are living in so-called forgotten disasters. And these are disasters that, despite an acute need that there is to respond, there isn't any sort of international media attention, there isn't any sort of political mobilization, and these people are just kind of left where they are. And you would expect that disaster response in themselves to reflect the extent of the suffering of the people there, but that's often not the case. When we think of large-scale humanitarian crises, we can think of the Haiti earthquake, the Japan earthquake, but the Taiwan typhoon, for example, as a recent example, or the Sichuan earthquake in China that happened in 2008, or the Kashmir earthquake that happened in 2005. These are things that necessarily don't immediately come into mind. So, it also reinforced these notions of what really does get attention and what really does get the people's interest. And then again, just in terms of definition, I define humanitarian response as the kind of disaster response that is inspired by the desire to promote welfare to all people, and it refers to the response on behalf of not only individuals, governments, corporations, and NGOs, but it's meant to be broad and capture a holistic set of responses. So relief efforts, aid, monetary donation, that kind of stuff. So the little nifty thing over here has my basic argument. And I argue that it's the conceptualization of victimhood that influences the response to disaster. And when I say conceptualization of victimhood, I mean the socially constructed profile of disaster-affected victims, or a lot of the discourses used to delineate victimhoods of nations and their people. And again, referring to the media notion, central to this argument is that how we think about victims is related through the media. Media in itself is extremely important when we're talking about disaster response, not only as a source of information and communication that facilitates a lot of the responses, but again, as sort of central to this conference's themes, at least for ours, is that it influences our thoughts and notions about victimhood. So again, the conceptualization of victimhood as reflected in, affirmed by, and constructed through the media, think about our mirror over there, is what affects humanitarian disaster response. So what I did to sort of investigate this claim was I did a case study. Okay, no. So to investigate these claims, I looked at the disasters in Haiti and Japan as two of the largest catastrophes to have occurred in recent memory. Just to give a bit of background about the two, Haiti earthquake happened in January 12th, 2010. It was a 7.0 magnitude earthquake that affected over 3.5 million people. It is known as one of the largest and worst humanitarian crises in recent memory. More than 200,000 deaths have occurred, with a loss incurred of $7.8 billion US. That is more than Haiti's GDP in 2008. 14 months later, a large earthquake of 9.0 magnitude struck the coast of Japan. On March 11th, 2011, it triggered waves, tsunami waves, and the meltdown of nuclear facilities, culminating in over 1,500 deaths and $235 billion in damages, and it is billed as the most expensive disaster in history. So the reason why I decided to compare these two are based on two case selection criteria. One being that they are the largest and biggest and most devastating disasters in albeit in different ways in recent histories. There's tons of media coverage on both of them, and they occurred in a similar or comparable time frame. So they're very timely, comparable, and data-rich units of observations. But more importantly, I think more interestingly, is that Haiti and Japan are very different countries. And I think I saw a lot of the comments that over there. When we think about Haiti, we think about poverty, instability. And then some of the comments for Japan said things about technology. Japan is the third largest economy in the world, for example. So with respect to political and economic statuses in the world, these countries, in many ways, represent positions on the opposite end of the spectrum in regard to global distribution powers of wealth and power. Of course, it's sort of a characterized, cartoonized version in my chapter 2. My third chapter sort of goes into detail about nuancing this sort of categorization. But Haiti, the poor, underdeveloped country, former colony, and then Japan, a rich industrialized nation, and things like that. Okay, so I'll go into the public discourse analysis part. My thesis is broken into multiple chapters. As you can see from this, there's conceptualization of victimhood, media, humanitarian response. I guess for purposes of today, I do want to focus just on the media aspect. In terms of methods, I did public discourse analysis, which is the quantitative and qualitative range of verbal, textual, and visual information distributed by the media. And what I specifically did was look at major top 25 US newspapers based on circulation rank. I used the Digital Archives of Museum, which is an organization devoted to journalism And I compare the front page coverage, literally what we see here, in their unedited and original form of both the disasters and the immediate aftermaths of their disasters. Namely, things that I wanted to focus on were things like the headline, the cover stories, quotes, photographs that were used. Additionally, to triangulate my claims, I also looked into award-winning images. And again, the purpose was to sort of illuminate the broader trends and representations of the discourses and frameworks that were used to conceptualize both Haiti and Japan as victims in the media space. So before I go into my findings, at least for this section, I do want to talk about the notion of the ideal victimhood. And my second chapter kind of goes into this in detail. But a corollary to the conceptualization of victimhood is the notion of the ideal or compassion-worthy victim. And these I sort of kind of created my own. I drew from theories on literature, on humanitarianism, discussions from anthropology, a bit of psychology, and it refers to the profile of the deserving victim, so to speak. And in order to configure as such, victims must incarnate notions of vulnerability and dependence. This conceptualization works to restore the innate imbalances in humanitarian giver-receiver relationships, not only justifying the work of the person who is doing the humanitarian response, but also maximizing his or her output. And in global historical humanitarian response context, this typical ideal has been objectified, has objectified certain kinds of victimhood, where mostly poor, non-white nations have been pathologized by people primarily from the West as the place of constant destitution and redeemed only through the benevolence, charity, and guidance of the benevolent other, or the outside savior, I'm sorry. So that's the notion of the ideal victimhood, and I guess I don't need to say much that Haiti sort of fit this category more than Japan did for various reasons. But before going to that, let's just talk about some of the findings that I found in terms of the media portrayals. So one thing that I found was media organizations conjure different types of horror gazes or dominant disaster narratives for Haiti and Japan. Whereas the narratives for Haiti were of humanity and plight, abject depictions of people as shown as vulnerable, helpless, and requiring of help. And Japan, on the other side, instead of focusing on the spectacle of humanity, was more focused on the spectacle of the disaster itself, the destructive capacity of the earthquake and tsunami, and oftentimes at the expense of the humanitarian tools that existed. And again, this is, I think, because Haiti corresponded to more ideal notions of victimhood. So the first image that we have here is headlines. And I describe headlines as the most salient point of the text. They're often differentiated in terms of whether they're bold, whether they're large, where they're sort of put. It's the most ubiquitous text, the most noticeable text, say at glance at a newsstand or something like that. And what I noticed that for Haiti, oftentimes the emphasis was on despair and vulnerability. Things like there's nothing or helpless written in caps lock, just accompanied by images of suffering victims often stood out. Language tended to be emotive. Things like anguish, misery, heartbreak, despair were all words used to describe the disaster in Haiti in terms of headline that were not used in Japan. On the other side, for Japan, the focus was on the earthquake and tsunami itself. I think the most common word was powerful. Things like slam, waves, and any sort of popular punny usage of that was also very salient. Sensationalistic words like ruin or hell was not used too much for Japan. Another thing I did was look at the cover stories. And the cover stories are featured articles that are included in the front page coverage. And I didn't look into every single one of the cover stories, but I chose 5 of the top U.S. newspapers: Washington Journal, Wall Street, Washington Journal, New York Times, and I think Chicago Tribune, and really delved into the content of their story and what they were saying. And I do have a lot of findings, but instead of boring you, I think one thing that I do want to focus on right now are the quotes of the people, and namely the victims. So these two are kind of basic examples. On the left, we see Haiti. A man saying, "I just want my wife's corpse." A woman saying, "Please save my baby. There's no one, nothing, no medicines, no explanations for why my daughter is going to die. I'm wet, help me." Someone cried as they try to get out of a rubble. And then, "Pay for it, we're dying." These are all different quotes of Haitian victims in the featured cover stories that I looked into. For Japan, I did not find as many victims or persons affected by the disasters quoted, but in the cases that there were often in large block text. I never experienced such a strong earthquake in my life. I thought it would stop, but it just kept shaking, and getting stronger. I got under the desk. We followed the orders of a person who had been appointed for this sort of thing. We do drills about once a year. So, when I was looking into the persons that were quoted in the agency and voices ascribed to the victims, it seemed that victims in Haiti tended to highlight the despair and powerlessness of the victims themselves. Individuals were often unnamed, injected as one-liners, as shown, and used to corroborate macabre scenes of whatever the author was trying to convey. In regard to the quoted individuals in Japan, the people were overwhelmingly experts. Most of them were non-disaster victims, but sort of people, climatologists, engineers, policy experts, economists, kind of clinically and sort of giving a diagnostic on what the implications of the disaster in Japan were. In the cases that disaster victims were portrayed, such as in these two examples, their names were given. They were also presented as very calm and collected and kind of giving an observational remark on the disaster. So that was also an interesting thing. Additionally, in every single cover story that I went through, every single cover story that I went through mentioned Haiti as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, but without contextualizing its poverty in sort of a larger global structure in terms of oppression, in terms of colonial legacy. And that was also something that I found a bit problematic in terms of insinuating that these are things that are inherent when in reality the conditions and vulnerability that Haiti finds itself in are oftentimes the direct product of legacies of oppression. So finally, the more sexier aspect of this project are the images. And I really looked into what made these disasters photogenic. And I guess for clarity's time's sake, I just have a couple of things that I do want to highlight. So these are some of the images that I found for Haiti. Oftentimes, there were very graphic portrayals of people that showed their emotions, their plight. The majority of the photo subjects were depicted as either dead, injured, or as shown in sort of undignified positions of vulnerability. The one on the right left is of a woman extending her hand. The one in the bottom corner is New York Times photo where you see bodies of dead persons lying. Children and women were also very popular subjects of photos, and out of the 80-something photos that I've identified as different for Haiti, the majority were human-focused. On the other hand, for Japan, the dominant theme seemed to be the focus of the disaster. There were Hollywood-like doomsday spectacle of the earthquake and tsunami, oceans of debris of burning buildings, roads cracked in the middle. A lot of these images were kind of reminiscent of apocalyptic disaster films. And in this case that people were shown, which were very few actually, I was only able to identify 10 out of 50 that included people. The picture on the bottom right also included. But when they were shown in sort of a dignified and calm way. They were often shown as depicted with their family. And in this case, for example, even though I identified the photo as having depicted a person, I think the emphasis was more to sort of accentuate and highlight the devastating capacity of the earthquake in itself. So that was sort of the media section for my thesis. And in later chapters, I talk about the conceptualization of victimhood and how that manifested in the humanitarian responses themselves. And I'm really not going to get too much into that, but just for, I guess, to close things up. What I found was that in terms of humanitarian responses, agency was taken away from Haiti. There was a focus on short-term rather than long-term goals, and its destitution was invoked when justifying the United States, for example, also invoked a lot of language that pathologized and continued to reinforce Haiti as a dependent place to justify its military presence there. In contrast, Japan, the response was a bit different. It was in the case that the United States was involved, for example, was under the directive of the Japanese people, NGO responses as well. A lot of the language and rhetoric also seemed to be cognizant or sort of more respectful of the idea that Japanese people and the government is trusted to sort of have a stake in their own recovery process, something that was not necessarily seen in Haiti. And I argue that these responses in themselves were functions of how Haiti and Japan were understood as victims. And again, when we talk about notions of victimhood, these are not things that sort of only exist, but are things that are actively reinforced and constructed through the media. Oh, all right, so that's pretty much it. I do want to say that to some extent, discrepancy in the portrayals is reflective of the, I do think that the discrepancy in the portrayals are reflective to some extent of the function of the disaster itself. For example, there was a huge tsunami that washed away victims. So, you know, photogenic moments, so to speak, predicated on bodies was not necessarily as common. But also at the same time to dismiss these findings as sort of a function of reality is very reductive in analysis. And as we talk about media and the role that media plays in constructing notions, we can't really negate their implications, especially in regard to how they reaffirm notions of victimhood and affect humanitarian responses. And even as the media appears to represent objectivity or strive for some sort of physical reality, it can't be understood as portraying the world in languages and ideas that are outside the social, political, cultural values, and oftentimes interests in which they come from. So when really looking into a lot of these media portrayals, I looked at it as layers of meticulous choice and decision, not necessarily as absolute actuality. So thank God that my advisor's not here. Here's where I have to talk about policy implications. And they also skipped over like the intellectual content and stuff like that. That's kind of gonna be outside of it, so I'm just gonna leave that there. But I think my framework of understanding victimhood sort of helps us give an explanatory tool for approaching humanitarian response, which, if I were to do the literature review part here, tends to be very focused on concrete ways of how response is created and don't really look at how ideas in themselves can also affect response. So that's my thesis in a nutshell. Thank you so much.
For those of you that are new to Theories in Action, these presentations are very different than thesis defenses. They're not about laying out and defending your argument, but more about exposing general audience to your ideas and making them accessible and then collaborating with your other panelists. So I thought you did a great job of that. A couple of questions for Takeru before we do the synthesis part. Yes?
I actually have a two-part question. I missed it in the earlier slide. You mentioned the casualty differences. What were the casualty differences in Haiti and Japan?
For Haiti, it was 200,000, and for Japan, it was 1,500. So of course, there is, in terms of scale, there is a huge difference.
Yeah, I was wondering if you analyzed, if you like talked about that at all, or like went into like how maybe the portrayals may have come as a result of like a huge disparity in the like just sheer number of casualties.
Mm-hmm. I think, especially when we talk about humanitarian responses in themselves, I do approach first and foremost the fact that a lot of these responses were contingent on the very acute and dire needs of the country. But when we talk about portrayal and we see time and time and again Haitians being portrayed as sort of this helpless, destitute people, in themselves it's sort of not, I think, is sort of outside of the context of whether or not the number of casualties was high. So for example, oftentimes in disaster narratives you see sort of framings and angles in which hope is inspired. Instead of showing dead bodies piled on the streets, there are a lot of images showing people smiling, families, and for the award-winning coverage, which I really didn't go into here, we saw that for Japan. But in the case of Haiti, time and again, there were burning corpses, people crying and wailing, being extremely emotive, rubble areas. A lot of how the visual and textual languages that were used to characterize Haiti even though they were, to some extent, reflecting the fact that these things were essentially happening. That sort of gratuitous overemphasis, I argued, was reinforcing certain notions of Haiti as being extremely vulnerable and something that's, to some extent, worthy of pity. And that's what I found issue with.
Thank you so much for your presentation, really wonderful. My question for you is about how both Japanese and Haitian victims responded to these representations of themselves, and if they responded, and how they chose to represent themselves in either Haitian or how Haitian and Japanese journalists chose to represent their countrymen and countrywomen, or if newspapers were not the primary media for the victims representing themselves, and in what other ways they chose to do that, and what effects you see, or what effect these very particular representations by North American newspapers you think had on the experiences.
So how did the victims, they themselves think of how they were portrayed?
Yeah, and how did they choose, and how did they choose to represent themselves?
That's a great question. I think it depends on what the source is, what the medium is. I'm very aware of the fact that when I operationalize media public discourse analysis, I use newspaper, which has its own sort of routines, which has its own sort of way of portraying news stories. And that in itself is also, I think a lot of my findings are also a function of that. If I were to look at cable television, if I were to look at radio, if I were to look at, news sources in Germany or in Asia or a country in Africa, I'm sure the portrayals of victims would have varied as well. For purposes of time and scope, I did operationalize it as U.S. news media, newspapers specifically. But to the extent of how the victims themselves responded to these sort of ways in which their story was presented, I guess, is something that I guess needs to be looked into, I guess, for more of a qualitative aspect. I do not necessarily know, at least in particular to my findings, how they've represented it, but those were questions that I was asking myself during this project.
Maybe one more question, just because there's been some people that haven't asked a question yet. Shane?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how much the sort of depictions are in conversation with the sort of historical relationships some countries might have had with Japan and Haiti. Like, for example, Haiti has consistently has a very paternalistic relationship, or rather, developed nations have a very paternalistic relationship with Haiti. Japan was characterized in a particular way during World War II, and sort of the history from that is sort of mega-apocalyptic sort of depictions of, world after destruction, and because it was seen as like an enemy, there was no sort of thought process around, why would we support them? They've been bombed, they're like an enemy. And here's this other catastrophic experience, so I wonder if that's also a holdover from, they were an enemy then, and we didn't want to help them then, why would we help them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think history is extremely important, and in terms of contextualizing why these depictions are the way they are. And my third chapter really goes into that in detail. I think another thing that I didn't mention about these two countries as comparisons are, they're both countries that, to some, in their history, have ties to the U.S. empire. Haiti was occupied in 1915 to 1934, Japan as well after its Second World War. And I think these notions, and a lot of the relations that Japan has to the United States, Haiti has to the United States, have also characterized a lot of the interests that people have as audiences to the US, but also media organizations as well. When I delved into the content of what types of stories were highlighted for for Japan, a lot of it was economic policies on the world. How the people in the U.S., how U.S. expats were dealing in Japan. So again, we see historical, cultural, and social relations between the countries also manifesting them in the content and portrayals themselves. And to a large extent, I do see my findings as a result of that. But yeah, I think that's a great point.
So Takeru and Devin, they chose as the title for their joint presentation, Mirror or Mirage, Race and National Identity in the Media. So they wanted to now transition into sort of a summary of their kind of thoughts about each other's projects, and then open it up to a more general conversation. So Devin.
Yeah, so in both of these studies, we saw how the identities of both large groups and individuals were portrayed in the media based on sort of common understandings, general ideas. But the prevailing notions are then reinforced, exaggerated, and even sometimes actively constructed by these images and narratives.
Yeah, and even just going back to the metaphor of the mirror that we used earlier, you know, yes, things are technically reflected in there. If I would look in there, I would see my face. But this reflection in itself is not necessarily real or accurate. Even looking at that one, there's a crack, there's a couple smudges. I wouldn't be able to see my whole face because of the post-it note. It's also dented. So, and not to mention the fact that mirrored images are also inverted. But we don't necessarily see the whole picture. And in the same vein that we don't really get to see the whole pictures when they're presented, whole picture of race, of countries when they're presented in the media.
This doesn't mean that the image we see there isn't important. There is a lot to learn from these images in narratives, even when they are warped in this way by the production companies, by the newspaper writers, by the goal of whatever communication is taking place. They still teach us about how these identities are formed, especially now when media, I mean, these images and narratives go out to so many people and there's so much access to it. It's bound to have this widespread influence.
Mm-hmm. And whereas David's case showed how it affects our notions of bodies and gender, they also have ramifications for how we perceive and treat others, people of different countries, as my thesis attempted to show. So that being said, we do have a couple sort of guiding questions to end it off with a discussion. And they really point to notions of identities of ourselves and others. So I think Devin's question first.
Well, we have a more general question that gives you a framework for this. How does media affect your understanding of your identity or others' identities? This is obviously the general theme here. And then specifically in terms of discourse around my project, do you feel that your body is represented in music videos or any related media that you encounter? And what are the identities that are attached to that? And do you associate yourself with those identities?
And then for mine, when do you feel compelled to help out victims of a disaster? To what extent are these feelings related to concepts of race and national identity? Have you considered these factors at all? And what role does the media play in informing you your desire to help a cause?
So you guys can take this in any direction that you please. I think probably it would be great to just turn again to the person next to you and discuss quickly just to get us talking again since you've been sitting there quietly for so long. And then we'd like to hear your thoughts, and if you have any other questions for us as well, that's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I feel like yes, and then sort of flip apart. I think we need to in so like abroad. I feel like all of them are kind of regardless of gender. But like, I think there is a mix, especially like perceived about in like and you feel like what identity is that oh, okay, the last one.
But it would have I identify with people.
What I find people like, whenever you say font festivals,
like guys.
I'm always like,
You guys want to finish up your thoughts and then we'll bring it up to the floor?
Because maybe we're a small enough group, we could kind of actually all get a chance to share a little bit. So do you want to, I don't know if we have a volunteer group that wants to start, like what
They
you
don't
end
have
up
it
talking
altogether.
about? Do you guys want to go first? Just kind of
What was I was about to say to you guys, a lot of what I was thinking about, especially for the second presentation, was how if I'm online and reading through some article or whatever, I see all these kind of different ads around me. And a lot of them will be displaying different particular images of women, or a lot of them will be during some natural disaster signs saying you should donate to this cause. And I think the time I've most kind of been persuaded to donate to a disaster cause was when an author, a favorite author of mine, of some story I was reading or something like that, would post at the end, say a manga or something else that I like to read, you should really donate to this.
You talked about celebrity influence, right, in your thesis?
Yeah, that's my point.
I guess just to go on that, I was just thinking about sort of in what situations have I or sort of my family donated to things. I think I oftentimes donate to, not necessarily thinking about natural disasters, but sort of to like cancer research centers and things. So I think that is just another way of looking at like victims and like in order to help out someone who can't help out themselves. So I think in that sense, I guess I haven't read through this whole question. But I think that the media would then also have a play sort of into what research centers or what type of diseases are really important to focus on.
We also talked a bit about the first question and just how I think all of us were kind of saying that we like yes to the first part of the question. We do see our bodies in music videos, but most of us were saying kind of no to the third part of the question, like we don't identify with it, which I thought was interesting.
We kind of talked about, we talked about the first question almost entirely, and we talked about how we, like, more, like, we feel like our ethnicities are represented in music videos, but less our, like, body types specifically, and how we don't really relate to the body types represented in music videos, and kind of talk about that.
yeah, going off that, I mean, like, I was thinking in particular, like, I'm thinking about extras in music videos or movies, and the idea that like the more you have of beautiful white women, the more it's like you're zooming out of it, and the more you would notice if one looked off or like transgressive or weird in some way or ugly, and instead of if you have like 100 women in bikinis in a music video, you're not asking people to look at them, you're asking people to not look at them, and I mean there's like a bunch of stuff I want to say. I think I have to admit that for me to be engaging my paradoxical imagination in terms of relating to this media that you so astutely kind of dissected makes me less likely to help. Like I read a book recently, it was by Khaled Hosseini's, not The Kite Runner, it was 1,000 Splendid Suns, and just people who haven't read it, basically, it felt to me a little bit like, it was very like informational and a little bit didactic. Basically, it felt like a high concept thing. He was going to go through the past 50 years of Afghan history, told from, it's a story of two women, one of whom is older, who was born in like the late 50s and was from a poor village, and she's like, a racial minority. And then the younger woman is like 30 years younger than she is, and she's from like Kabul and like an educated family, and she's like whiter and more wealthy, and so the two of them end up getting married to the same like horrible guy, and the Taliban show up, and they're both suffering intensely, but then the poor, illiterate, older woman ends up killing the husband to save the younger woman, who can then go on and like flee and like find a better life for herself. And then the older woman gets executed by the Taliban, but she's at peace because she feels like she made the most of her life, even though she had like no potential. So she exercises as much agency as she possibly could. And I remember, like, I read the book, I felt a little bit exploited by it, and then I immediately wanted to donate to KhalilHusseini.com, which is a foundation for Afghan women, and I felt like hugely moved. And at the same time, knowing that it was problematic in its depiction of women, and I'm sure of ethnic groups and the rural, urban, it's very much playing to those tropes in me, but also feeling it's very effective. And then the last thing I wanted to say to Kara is, like, what I noticed in looking at the images, like, when I think of, like, what is a stereotype, like, the stereotype that I felt like it was enacting in terms of Japanese culture is almost like the image of the samurai, like, with a very disciplined body and very serene in the face of, like, this, like, tumultuous chaos and that kind of horror.
I definitely go into that as well. A lot of the, especially like talking media heads, for example, would say things like, this is a very civilized society. They're very organized. They're very orderly. The people would all line up for food rations, and a lot of the depictions and the ways in which the people were reflected were also culturally and racially stereotyped.
And I was going to ask, like, it seems to me, because I also noticed that when you have the list of, like, key topics or whatever, like, the war crimes and obviously, like, our history of, the racist depictions of Japanese people throughout World War II. And it seems to me, like, at least in looking, like, it seems like we've kind of sanitized that history, or I don't know if we've, like, legitimately turned the page in terms of how we relate to the Japanese people, but I didn't see evidence of that. Is there any evidence that you saw in the coverage?
The social media was pretty salient on that, and when the Japanese World Cup team, the female World Cup team won, for example, and also when the earthquake happened, there were a lot of Twitter and Facebook updates saying things like, payback or Pearl Harbor. And so, a lot of these narratives and things that are said are also contextualized in a historical account. And you might necessarily not see them manifest in large media organizations, but it's not something that I necessarily looked into, but has been discussed in terms of, coming out in terms of social media sites.
So we started about 15 minutes late, and knowing that our guy's on the clock, we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to let you take it wherever you want. If you want to take more questions or say more, but we have about 5 minutes left.
Do people have questions that they'd like us to answer before time runs out?
This looks quite scary. I was wondering what you thought about this theory where crisis forming any sort of disaster as a form of crisis solicits humanitarian response rather than using the media. So, for example, I was talking here about how like natural disasters kind of remove human agency, even though there's debate about whether or not it changes the epigenetic from formations of victimhood versus human-caused crises such as wars.
So if the crisis was not a natural disaster, how would this configure? Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I specifically decided to look at natural disaster victims, because when we think about natural disasters, the people themselves didn't call it upon themselves for it to happen. So in that sense, you're able to sort of put things on a level playing field. I haven't looked into the literature of how these ideas are then configured and changed when we talk about self-made crises. But the Japan case is actually pretty interesting because the subsequent nuclear meltdown disaster and all the discussion surrounding it was very much treated as a, poor regulations, no adequate safety standard, that kind of way. So I think a lot of that also had to do with the shift away from looking at the victims of the Japanese disaster as sort of a humanitarian crisis in itself.
This is just directed at Devin. I mean, I'm sure you've thought about this a ton, but like, in terms of depictions, like when you showed the Feminina video, there are so many, I mean, it's great. There's so many ways that it's also like, in some ways, like oppressive, because all media is oppressive, and anytime you voice something, you violate something else. And I'm wondering, like, how you see, I mean, can you talk about why you really liked that video, like why you thought that it was representing progressive you were at least racial, if not like sex, if even in terms of not of gender but of race, like why you thought that was a positive message?
So part of that video is the lyrics, and they do matter and they are important, and it's hard to get the full scope of it without hearing the words that are being said, which are very strong in terms of being satisfied with oneself and having faith in the ability of the world to change. And they are self-contained, and they don't talk about oppression explicitly, but they're saying that, you know, an individual can hold up against the weight of the world. The other thing that's really significant about that video to me is that you see a woman dancing. She is dancing alone. She is dancing even in profile. As one of the major things about the Agua na Boca videos, you see these women in profile, and their faces are completely removed from their bodies in that sense. And also you see, I think you guys probably noticed that in some of the shots, I mean, they were cut off at the neck and at the thighs, and so you have this disembodiment, really, and with very similar techniques and a very similar content. I felt, and this is my own emotional response, I'm sure, but I felt that the dancing that was being shown in the Feminina video was much more individually expressive and much less, I am dancing for you, man, looking at me, singing about me. And that to me, I think, is the most important part, is that her body is not being exploited, it's not being used for someone else's pleasure. You know, she is dancing, clearly it's still choreography and it's still, you know, to get a point across. But the dancing is just so different in its expression that was a big part of it for me. And just responding, like, I personally, I don't think that every message is exploitative, and I don't think that voicing something means silencing something else. I don't think that that's necessary. I think that's how things have functioned for a long time. But I have faith, and I think that that can change. So
I'm sorry that has to be our last question. Would you both like to end with any closing thoughts?
Text mirror.
thank you guys for the awesome discussion and questions.